Okay, so Christoph said something pretty telling in the last presentation, and that is that everybody's a Fed. And that's basically how I feel all agencies are. We just have a lot of web guys, and we very seldom have dedicated native mobile guys. So the situation kind of looks like this, which this is really slow, so I'm going to have to learn to use the slag, where all the guys in white are web developers, and home in pink there is the mobile guy. So what comes out of this is basically people want to know, well, how can I make a mobile app in the App Store that uses web technologies, right? And there's a few routes to do this, and I've happened to done many of them, so I thought I'm going to talk about those, the strengths and weaknesses, and at the end, my goal is that we'll have some sort of common understanding about what the tools are, what the strengths and weaknesses are, and if nothing else, what my opinions on those are. So, and then the second goal is if we kind of know what we're talking about a little bit, maybe we can utilize more developers on more mobile apps. And then finally, we've kind of got this agenda of cross-functional teams. So the more we spread the knowledge, the more we should be able to support cross-functional teams. So, boy, this is so slow. I wish I was... All right, so what are our options? Number one, I'm going to talk about PhoneGap and similar options. Then I'm going to talk about Titanium. So somebody's familiar with Titanium, okay. And then I'm going to talk about a native app with HTML components. All right. This is so slow. All right. Judgment criteria. Technology choice affects app feel. This is probably the number one thing that I don't hear anybody talking about, but it's the number one thing that drives a native app developer nuts. And that is apps feel better when they're written native, when they have the native UI components. And that's for a few reasons. Number one, just native runs faster, so you're going to get a better frame rate. You're going to get smoother animations and so forth. But secondarily, there's a lot of conventions that are sort of built into these native components that don't quite sync up when you use a web interface instead. There's certain transition timings when a view is displayed. There's certain types of views that are used depending on what kind of information is being displayed and so forth. And when you do this in a web page, you tend to, it just doesn't quite have the same feel. And it's almost like an uncanny valley. Like the harder you get to get close to an app, the more you start feeling like it's off. The best example I saw of one of these, Peter showed it to me actually. It was a weather app, and it was all done in HTML5. And at first I didn't realize it was, but when we were using it, it just felt like something was broken a little bit. Like it was a little bit choppy, just a little bit off. And then Peter said, well, this is a web app. And so it was kind of like, well, perfect example of, the uncanny valley and the dangers of using web tools to sort of fake native tools. Development time. If you're going to go multi-platform, writing native per platform is going to take more time. And writing a single code base, or as close as you can to a single code base for web technologies, will take less time. I think I covered that one. And then finally, costs. Some of these tools aren't free. So, if you're doing a small project, I think that affects your choice, right? You don't want to pay a large licensing fee if you don't have a lot of budget. All right. So these criteria, of course, change weight based on the situation. One is resources available. A lot of agencies just don't have native developers. A few years ago, I was contracting, and I talked to a lot of different agencies, and so many of them just did not have any mobile developers at all. And, a lot of them didn't even have any mobile work at all. They were just sort of saying, well, we need a mobile guy before we can get the mobile work, right? So ISITE was this rare exception where we actually had some resources dedicated to native mobile, which is not common. Client expectations. Some clients want a really slick, nice app, and some just want to be in the App Store and don't really care how they get there. And it's important to know which one they want. I have an example later where I did not meet the expectations because client wanted slick. I did web, and I got in a lot of trouble. So budget, I sort of touched on that one, but if you have to have a lot of platforms and you don't have a lot of developers or a lot of budget, right, you're going to have to use one of these multi-platform tools. And scope. I feel like native scales better, right? You don't have to plan as well as you do in JavaScript. At least in my experience, if you build an app in JavaScript and the scope keeps increasing, you're getting more and more punished. Whereas I feel like in native, because it runs faster, because of a few reasons, your app will actually scope better, so you can commit more sins early on and you're not as punished later. Whereas I feel like with web, you get punished if you're not planning ahead. And I don't know how else, but if you're not planning ahead, you're going to get punished if you use web. And then finally, existing client sites and apps. If they have an existing code base, you probably want to just build off of what they've got, or at least utilize. If they have a mobile web page, it's going to PhoneGap well. If you're going to use a native app, you might just want to take some of their base libraries and build them into your native app. Okay, PhoneGap. So what is PhoneGap? Well, PhoneGap is a dedicated browser with feature hooks, right? The UI is 100% web. The app is written basically in web languages. Typically JavaScript is going to be what controls all your logic. It's open source, and I don't know why it's not in here. I guess it's probably the first feature here, and it's free. So why use PhoneGap? Well, it is Fed-friendly, right? If you don't have a native app developer, Fed can pretty much go into PhoneGap and build you an app. It is your fastest route from mobile web page to an app. So if you've got a web page that the client likes and loves, you can put it in the App Store without really much work at all. It's cross-platform. I think it hits iOS, Android, Windows, and I don't know if it hits BlackBerry. So why avoid PhoneGap? Well, number one, it's probably going to be bad app feel because it's a web page. As a result, you're going to burn a lot of time trying to make it feel good, and I'll leave it at that. These kind of tools always lag behind the latest and greatest OS features because you tend to wait for the community to add support for you, right? So if Apple has announced the latest iOS 8 features, PhoneGap's not going to have those first, whereas the folks that get the APIs and do native apps will have them first. There is some specialization required, right? These actually have their own API to hit those hooks. So it's not like a perfect, you can come in with web and you're going to know exactly what to do. At some point, if you want to hit the camera or you want to hit a microphone or something like that, you're going to have to use the PhoneGap API, and so there's a small learning curve there. And in my opinion, it's a bad fit for single platform because apples to apples, if you're just going to write for one platform, I think you can do it just as fast in native, and I think native actually produces a better app. So I wouldn't personally use PhoneGap for a single platform application. And then I'm going to use a quote from Gilo. He said, "Name a great PhoneGap app." I can't name a great PhoneGap app. What's that? Well, that's going to be my example coming up. So yeah. All right, so here's the, in fact, it's the next slide, so very good, Gene. Man, why is this lag so random? All right, so this is our Cambridge app. This was built in PhoneGap, and this is actually an iOS screenshot. So this is a good example of bad app feel, but on the flip side, a very functional app. So even though it looks like an Android app and it has a drop-down that looks like a web page, this is an iPhone app. And I believe the client's actually happy with it, but on the flip side, I don't know if I would carry this one around and show it off and say, look how awesome PhoneGap apps are, right? I mean, it did its job, but I don't think it's one that's going to get you any customers on style points. And here's another one that we did not build, but used a similar web page to app type program. And I encourage you to download it and just take a look at what an app that's built with one of these web tools feels like. They're just a little bit cheap feeling at times. All right, so what about an in-house PhoneGap or a web wrapper where you don't use PhoneGap, you're just going to build something custom that's tailored to your app, but you're still going to primarily use web for your UI. I called it a PhoneGap for lack of creativity. It is a tiny custom PhoneGap. The UI is pretty much web. You can get away with some things in native, like maybe tabs. It has custom JavaScript hooks that you're going to have to build yourself. And so why would you use this? Actually, I did build one of these, so I had some rationality when I used it. The first one is that you can utilize more than one developer. So I was on a project where we didn't have enough time, and the only way I saw we could get it done was if I utilized an idle Fed person to basically build the UI while I built the core. And so we basically doubled our hours the time we had. And when you do this, you kind of get out of needing any cross-domain knowledge, right? The web developer can make the web page, the app developer can make the app, and how do I put this? The web developer doesn't need to get into Xcode and build something, and the iOS developer doesn't have to write crappy web code like I tend to do. So you get an app that's tailored to your needs. There's nothing in it that you don't need, which is nice because you get a small, tight app, and it meets the client's needs and doesn't do anything extra. All right, so why avoid it? Well, it's basically PhoneGap, right? So all those things I said I didn't like about PhoneGap, I don't like about the PhoneGap. You do have the overhead now of building all the hooks yourself, right? Whereas PhoneGap has all these hooks built and they have an API, and none of that exists in a PhoneGap. You have to come up with it yourself, which takes a lot of time. There's no community, so same problem, right? Nobody else is out there solving problems for you. You're now an island building your own custom application. It's not going to go back to mobile web as fast. So whereas PhoneGap basically is a mobile web page, this one you might, well, I'll tell you what I did is I actually went a little bit overboard and had too many hooks, and so it basically wasn't a web page anymore. It was just this hybrid thing that was neither app nor page. So this is actually the app I'm talking about when it comes up on the screen in the next 10 minutes. And that is, we're working on a SharePoint competitor, and we weren't given a lot of time. And so what I had done was built this part here with the folders and the list. That was all web, and then the tabs and the navigation bar at the top was native. And at the time, I thought it was a pretty clever solution, but it turned out the client actually was really upset that it wasn't native. He could tell pretty quickly that this was not a native scroller, and we actually ended up losing that client. So, so painful memory on that one. Key takeaway, warn them when you're going to use web. On the flip side, this is one we worked at here, and this is an app that's on iOS and Windows PC, Mac, and I think they wanted to get to Android in the Chrome store. So this was an example where I actually pitched we should use HTML because app feel really isn't an issue, right? You're not scrolling a lot of things, you're not touching a lot of things. You're basically, in this app, you actually sing along and it records. So I didn't see any reason why we couldn't do something like a Chrome app and then put it in a wrapper and get it on various platforms. All right, so the next option outside of a PhoneGap type thing is Titanium. Just taking a while to load. Titanium is it's basically the JavaScript interpreter taken out of something like a browser, like I think it's actually Mozilla's JavaScript interpreter, and they put it inside a tool that renders to native UI components. So you have your JavaScript interpreter, you have the Titanium API, and it does some magic. Then you have the Titanium native core, and those latter two combine to render you an actual native app. But all the code is actually done in JavaScript. And the idea is you can write, your JavaScript code base, and the wrapper is going to take care of making sure it goes on every platform, but it gets rid of the app feel problem because you got, in theory, a native UI. So why use Titanium? Well, it's multi-platform. Oh, man, it's slow. It's multi-platform. It's throwing me off. It's like I think I'm going to look at the screen and it's not there. It's
just for the record, that's go to be.
Yeah, it's not. It's yeah. No, I did not optimize my pictures because I am not a good web developer. I will. Well, I can live with it. I'm just griping for fun, but
You're killing me, man. No, just it does have one of those, right?
Well, actually, no. I have to have a USB adapter. I'd have to go to my desk. So anyway, multi-platform, iOS, Android. At one time, they promised BlackBerry. I don't know if they ever got to Windows. It's Fed-friendly in theory because it's all JavaScript. You get good app feel because it's basically using native components. And it's extendable via native modules. So if you have a library that's native, you can expose it via these modules and write your own custom JavaScript hook to get to it, right? So so you're not limited to just whatever HTML supports or JavaScript supports or whatever. All right, so why avoid titanium? There we go. All right. Well, it's harder to debug because now you have so many different components. Yeah, this robot here in this episode, by the way, he can't take the stress of blowing up this bomb, so he just kills himself. But not very PC. Anyway, so you're writing JavaScript code, so you got bugs there. You could potentially have problems where Titanium is interpreting it. You've also got the Titanium API, which you might not know how to use. And then you have the native stuff running underneath. And so when there's something wrong, you don't really know where it's happening. You have to go through all these layers to get to it. Just like PhoneGap, it's going to lag behind the latest OS features, and you would have to put them in yourself if you wanted them earlier than when Titanium gives them to you. And I suspect if you're using Titanium, you probably aren't somebody who's on the bleeding edge of every single platform capable of doing this. You're going to need a specialist because the Titanium API is not. I mean, it's not like anything else. It's something you have to know how to do. There's a learning curve, and it doesn't apply to anywhere else. So bear in mind, you're not writing something that's going to port to mobile web or anything like that. The behavior actually varies per platform, and I haven't used this deeply for a couple of years, but it tended to be something that would work perfectly on iOS. It would work terribly on Android. Even simple things like rolling a little bar would work on one and not the other. I spent probably a week and a half just trying to get an OAuth library to work on Android. And so really, that alone actually takes what is a pretty good idea and makes it a pretty awful product because you spend so much time just trying to get it to work on Android. Yeah, so like I said, build once, debug everywhere. That's the famous quote, right? Man, yeah. I think a lot of times people hear Titanium and they think, well, we're going to cut our development time in half because we only need one code base for 2 platforms, let's say. But the truth is you write on one, you debug it on the other, you might break it on the first one, you go back and forth, and it's actually kind of a nightmare. It doesn't scale well. I don't know how to explain it other than ghosts in the machine kind of get in there. And part of it might be I'm a bad JavaScript developer, but I think part of it is just the product. Because it's hard to debug, it's hard to know what's going on, so it's hard to, as your product scales, it's hard to know how to fix it. All right. This is my network. What is this? This is is Thunderbolt to network? Okay. And there's a licensing fee, actually, a pretty big one. It scales with your company, but it's not free, and it's not cheap. I think for the project we were on, it was a $10,000 fee. And that was after we talked them down from 13. So, and said painful anecdote is actually this one right here, which won't come up on the screen for me. All right, here it is. So this was a competitor to the speed test app, and we wrote one for a client. And they required that we did it all in JavaScript. We were not allowed any custom modules. And the idea was they wanted to be on Android, which they weren't on yet. They did actually have a native BlackBerry and a native iOS app. And the theory was Titanium was going to go to BlackBerry. So they were going to hit all 3 with one code base. But like I said, it actually ended up being a pretty big nightmare because we spent so much time just getting Titanium to work that we lost a lot of the benefits of being multi-platform. I wish I could go back in time and tell them just to reskin the native app for iOS, reskin it for BlackBerry, and just write a native Android app. I think that would have been better for everybody. With that said, though, there are some good examples of Titanium. Our buddies down the hall, Globe Sherpa, wrote their ticket app in Titanium. And, I actually think it's a good candidate for Titanium because I think for them, maintenance is a big issue. They want to keep their app alive for a long time. So having one code base for multiple platforms makes sense. There's not a lot of stuff there's not a lot of like whiz-bang going on, right? There's not a lot of animations, not a lot of fanciness, so they don't have as many problems of going, they don't have the animation problems like where animation is going to work on iOS, but it's not going to work on Android because this does so little visually, there's less of that lowest common denominator problem. All right, so finally, a Fed-friendly native app. This is Steve Mobs from The Simpsons, by the way. I don't know why they do Steve Mobs and not Steve Jobs. It's a native app where the core functionality is native and the UI is largely native. But large chunks of your content are done in HTML. and all your non-critical logic could stay in JavaScript. All right, so why build a Fed-friendly native app? I don't know why it's not showing my bullet. There it is. It has the best app feel, right? I mean, all the fancy things like collection views and whatever kind of transitions you want to get in iOS, well, you've got them now, or in Android or whatever. You can leverage all the latest native goodies without having to wait for somebody. You can have more focused developers, right? You can have your Fed guys, like I said earlier with the PhoneGap, you can have your Fed guys focusing on Fed, and you can have your native guys focusing on native. It scales well. I think I'm a little biased because I can scale an app in native much better than JavaScript, but I also think, like I said, you can get away with a lot more programming sins if you're just running code faster. All right, so why avoid it? This is not helping. You know, what amazes me is it doesn't get the bullet right away. All right, so it requires an expert per platform. Like, you're going to need your Android dev, you're going to need your iOS dev, and so forth. There's a potential gray area problem, much like we have this problem in the PhoneGap one a little bit too. But the idea is, you can do any layout you want in native. When are you going to decide it's easier to do it in web versus when is it easier to do it in native? I don't know. We kind of have a lack of experience if we're going too deep with web in a native app, but yeah, I'd like to try it. All right, so here's an example of one where we did try it a little bit. This is our Esri Events app, and the top there is actually all native, but the bottom is all HTML. And what's nice is you can't tell the difference when you're just using the app. Yeah, and in my opinion, we could have done the entire view here in HTML, and nobody would have noticed. The important thing to me is all the stuff you're touching is native, so the menus, the tables, that kind of thing, that should all be native. And anything you're just looking at but not really interacting with, well, then you can just use HTML. There we go. All right, so in conclusion, Fed and mobile should work together more often. I hope we have a more realistic understanding of how I see the tools, if nothing else, and maybe we all have a better understanding of the tools. Tool selection is context sensitive, right? Don't let your client think you're going to build a native app and build a web app. But on the flip side, don't pitch them an expensive multi-platform native solution if they're not going to want it. Yeah, get the client to approve it. I think this one isn't a problem here, but I've been at companies where there's just a lack of willingness to defer work to some other department. So bear in mind, you should be willing to say, all right, this really should be native, or I should be able to say, this really should be web, and, we'll send it to that. And then I think there's some opportunities for standardization. I'm sure Christoph has a lot of standard ways of doing things. Do you hate standards? Well, then no standardization. No. Yeah, so I'd be curious to see how our standards line up with Fed standards and see if we can't come up with a tech standard in general. All right, that's it.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. And I actually have a question on the Esri app. That was all, there isn't like to do the Fed-friendly thing, this would be something that we would come up with a framework for.
Right. So I basically imagine, like I said, everywhere that you have to interact with a lot, that should be native. Because you can tell, the inertia on a table moving up, right? That's very distinct on every platform. How a view slides in is very distinct. And so I think if you can get at least the fundamentals in native, the static stuff nobody's going to notice. So I don't know where the exact cutoff is, but that's my thought.
Just to explain the Esri app, that they decided to go with PhoneGap because of timing, and so that they could get done. And what was it, in February?
Well, so yeah, unfortunately, that Esri app, which I thought we did a lot of good work for, the client had sort of an internal political shift, and they decided they wanted to redo the whole app in PhoneGap, and they had some devs that thought, well, we'll just bang this out in a month or 2 months. And it's been, I think, 5 months now. They don't have it out yet. It's not necessarily easier to write something in web languages. And like I think scale is what got them on this one. This particular app had a lot of data to it, and we had to do a lot of threading and other tricks to make it actually go quick. And I don't think threading is supported in PhoneGap, so I don't know how they're solving it.
I know security usually is more of an architectural conversation, but inherent to the 3-4 different ways of coding here. Can you speak to security at all? Like, which ones maybe are better or worse?
I can't speak to security in JavaScript very well. I did, for Moda Health, I used an encryption library for our data, but I don't know how secure it really was. I think on native it's a little more inherently secure because, well, first of all, you can encrypt and decrypt faster, which is the most obvious way. And then secondarily, I mean, I think the data stores are just in a proprietary format on a native, whereas with web, I think you have to use something that's fairly open. You could probably tell me that one. But
My general feeling would be anytime you're using sandbox, it's more stuff.
yeah, I mean, as far as I know, web's just less secure. So.
Yeah. Anytime you're using JavaScript to basically run under native, you add people attack surface in your JavaScript interpreter to your app. So when it comes to security holes, now you have to worry about security holes in PhoneGap or security holes in Titanium or Xamarin or anything like that, in addition to security holes in Android or iOS. Or you might. I'm not. I'm just going to repeat a different question. Where do you think Xamarin fits in all this stuff? Because my understanding is Xamarin takes C# and compiles it to native iOS and native Android, so it doesn't end up with the JavaScript, compilation.
Compile it, or does it just like interpret it and then have a?
My understanding is it compiles to native bytecode.
It actually, well, it's probably better than Titanium, but.
We have a session on
I like
it later,
C#. I don't know. I mean, I think if it's your route to making an app and you can't make an app otherwise, use it. But
Right there, Jeff, do you have
Compiles. Yes.
it compiles.
Was that the question?
Yes.
You didn't need a mic for that.
Yes.
All right. So, related question, I had assumed that Titanium is actually compiling in some level in like.
I thought so too,
doesn't it?
but and then I later discovered it does not.
So there's a runtime.
There's a runtime JavaScript. Yes, at least it was last when I used it. I don't know if they've made it better.
I also thought the same about PhoneGap, but
PhoneGap's just a web browser as far as I
part of
know.
it.
Yeah. So.
We have about 7 minutes. Any other questions? Right.
So, Chris, when was the last time you played around with PhoneGap?
I have never really played around with PhoneGap other than modification.
Have you been following the project very closely? I asked because
I don't
I
follow PhoneGap.
What's that?
I don't follow PhoneGap.
Okay. Because I was at Adobe's conference last week, and they wouldn't shut up about PhoneGap. And they, it was probably about a quarter of their talk tracks were centered around enterprise mobile and PhoneGap. And they're integrating PhoneGap with the CMS that they purchased a few years ago and trying to come up with what they think is kind of a strategy for what you've been speaking to. But they were really more focused on things around PhoneGap, but not PhoneGap itself.
Well, I think they're talking about Xamarin being bought out by Microsoft for the same thing, right? A CMS is going to deliver. I don't know. I mean, I think that's kind of cool. And I think you can get around the needing to go through the app stores to update your app with that kind of thing. But on the flip side, you still kind of have all the same flaws of app feel, how fast code executes and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, Adobe bought PhoneGap.
One thing with Xamarin too, it uses native on the front end, right? It's all native. You have to have, so it's the best, supposedly the best of both worlds, where it's compiled .NET code into native.
Let's say it looks like it has some positives, since we haven't actually developed much with Xamarin yet to say that it's the best.
Potentially the best.
Well, bear in mind it's going to lag behind features too, right? I mean, they have to have their compiler be able to take C# and make it to the latest, greatest iOS thing or Android thing.
They were, this could be marketing speak, but they were saying that they're like 24 hours behind when a new feature comes out in iOS. Like
It has the best ever release.
they're like,
Well, that's pretty good. So at least they are aware of some of the issues.
yeah. So not that I'm pimping for it, I'm just saying because it seems like an alternate. All right, cool.
Anybody else?
All right, then you have 10 minutes for a break.